My name is Ava. I'm 32, and I was abandoned on my wedding day by the man I loved and the best friend I trusted more than anyone. Just last month, I stood there in my white dress, heart racing, thinking I was about to start my forever. My dad held my hand, the music played, 200 guests held their breath. But instead of vows, there was dead silence. Instead of a kiss, came the kind of betrayal you don't see coming. They didn't just leave, they disappeared together, slipping out the back door into a black SUV, and never came back. And the woman who left with him? My maid of honor? The girl who'd been my best friend since 7th grade. If you think I broke down, I didn't. I went cold. Because they didn't just ruin a wedding, they triggered a storm. If you think this story ends in heartbreak, think again. Before I show you how I made them both regret it, hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe. Now let me take you back to the day it all began. My fiance didn't just leave me at the altar. He left while the harpist was still playing the prelude, while my father was still gripping my hand with trembling pride, while 200 guests held their breath waiting for the vows. He left as I stood there, laced in ivory, lips painted soft rose, bouquet trembling in my fingers, heart wide open, thinking I was about to marry the man I'd trusted with every part of me. But instead of promises, I got silence. Instead of a kiss, I got a hollow ache. And when the music stopped, so did everything I thought I knew about love. He didn't run alone. No, he ran with the one person I had chosen to stand beside me on that sacred day. The woman I had whispered my fears to in middle school sleepovers, who held my hair back in college heartbreaks, who said she'd die before hurting me. My maid of honor, my best friend, my betrayer. They slipped out the side door like cowards, leaving behind gasps, confusion, and a room full of stunned faces. Someone caught a glimpse of them getting into a black SUV parked behind the chapel. And just like that, they were gone. Gone without a word, without a note, without shame. My mother collapsed into sobs behind me. My father kept holding my hand, too stunned to speak, his fingers trembling with a kind of pain that no father should have to carry. And me, I didn't cry. Not then, not there. I stood still, my skin ice, my spine steel. I scanned the crowd of confused relatives, floral arrangements, and flickering candles, like I was witnessing someone else's nightmare. But it was mine to endure, mine to remember, and mine to rewrite. Because what they didn't know, what no one in that chapel knew, was that this wouldn't be the end of my story. They may have escaped the wedding, but they would not escape the truth. And when it came, it wouldn't just sting, it would scorch. Now, if you think being left at the altar was the worst part, think again. What came next made me feel like I was buried alive, while the world watched and judged. The days that followed felt like a slow-motion collapse, an avalanche of shame crashing down while I was still standing in my wedding shoes. My phone lit up constantly, not with comfort, but with headlines, group texts, hushed calls from relatives who just wanted to check in, and worse, articles labeling my ex-fiancé and my best friend as enlightened souls who had escaped the matrix of expectation to pursue some divine truth together. They weren't hiding. They posted daily updates from their so-called self-love retreat, where they meditated in white linen and held hands beneath dream catchers, hashtags glowing with spiritual superiority, # healing, # detox from toxicity, # radical awakening. Everyone knew exactly who the toxicity was. Me, the abandoned bride with too much emotion and not enough alignment. I texted, no reply. I called, blocked, from both of them. The people I loved most had not only disappeared, they had erased me, then rewritten me into their story as the villain. Friends I thought were mine sent awkward texts, hesitant emojis, or worse, radio silence. Family gave pitying stares, but didn't know what to say, didn't want to pick sides, didn't want to believe that the golden couple who lit up their timelines could be capable of cruelty. But I knew. I felt it. Every time someone looked at me, with that mix of awe and discomfort, like I was a walking tragedy, I sank deeper into a silence I didn't choose. Then came the invoices, the receipts, the bone-cold math, over $42,000, venue, flowers, catering, rings, paid almost entirely from my personal account, a wedding I would never have, a life I never got to live, and still, no one stood beside me. Not one person truly said, "I believe you." I wasn't just heartbroken, I was caged, locked in a story they crafted, one where I was the bitter leftover of their enlightenment, the girl who couldn't keep up with their spiritual evolution, the bride who became a cautionary tale. And in that suffocating silence, in that manufactured prison of shame and disbelief, a tiny breath of clarity formed. Because if no one was coming to save me, then I would have to burn my way out. Have you ever been so broken that clarity becomes your only weapon? What I found next didn't just change how I felt. It changed everything I thought I knew about them. 3 days after the wedding that never was, I returned to the venue. Not because I wanted to, because I had to. The planner had called, asking if I wanted to collect the leftover decor before it was discarded. The peonies were wilted. The aisle runner was rolled up and stained with dried champagne. But what caught my eye wasn't any of that. It was a necklace, a gold chain tucked in the corner of the bridal suite, half buried under the armrest of the velvet chair where my so-called best friend had sat the morning of the ceremony, sipping mimosas and assuring me I was glowing. It was delicate but odd. Hanging from it was a small pendant engraved with a symbol I didn't recognize. A triangle inside a circle, carved with the precision of ritual, not fashion. I slipped it into my purse, unsure why my fingers were trembling. That night, unable to sleep, I remembered something. A blurry Instagram story she had posted weeks earlier. A book she had been reading on the beach. Spine cracked, cover tilted toward the sun. The Path of Submission. At the time, I thought it was some self-help nonsense. But now it looked like a warning I hadn't understood. I searched the title. My screen filled with message boards and horror stories of an organization called Lumen Union, of whispered meetings in candlelit rooms, of high-control tactic masked as spiritual rebirth. The more I read, the faster my breath came. The words they had used, cleanse your timeline, release your dependence, unshackle from legacy thinking, they hadn't been quirky affirmations. They were doctrine. And then it clicked. The sudden resignations from work, the odd weekend retreats, the shared journal they never let me read. I began collecting everything. Screenshots, bank statements, that weird shared credit card they'd convinced me to sign. I reached out to a lawyer I knew from my nonprofit days. I didn't say much, just enough. Her reply came quickly. Meet me and bring the pendant. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by wedding favors and unopened gifts and promises that had evaporated into incense and half-truths. But something had changed. My pain hadn't vanished. It had crystallized, hardened, focused. They hadn't just broken my heart. They had scouted me, groomed me, positioned me as their next donation stream. I was supposed to be their ticket into a higher echelon of cult-funded influence. But they had miscalculated. I wasn't confused. I wasn't delusional. And I damn sure wasn't dead. I was wide awake. And I was taking notes. I know some of you are wondering, why didn't I fight back sooner? The truth is, when betrayal runs this deep, you don't just react. You calculate. You strike where it hurts the most. I walked into the office of a financial crimes attorney wearing the same trench coat I'd cried into 3 nights in a row. Her name was Jenna Hart. Sharp mind, sharper heels. I handed her the files I had collected. Bank records, screenshots, the pendant. She barely blinked as she sifted through the numbers. And then she said it. Your friend transferred over $18,000 into something called the Lumen Foundation, nonprofit status, but all the red flags of a laundering shell. I felt the words land like bricks in my chest. Not just betrayal, premeditated fraud. I wasn't collateral damage. I was a target, but I didn't flinch. I asked her how far we could go. She raised an eyebrow. Most people want an apology. I smiled, slow and steady. No, I want to go biblical. The next day, I hired a private investigator, someone Jenna trusted. He was discreet, efficient, and ruthless in the way that only justice can be when it's personal. Within 2 weeks, I had audio recordings of group meetings, chanting in dimly lit hotel rooms, bizarre mantras, and worse, clear dialogue from both my ex-fiancé and my ex-best friend talking about securing Ava's buy-in before the union ceremony. They hadn't planned a wedding. They had planned a fundraiser, a con, and I was the prize package wrapped in tulle and diamond lace. But I didn't go to the police. Not yet. That would have been too easy, too quiet, because they had planned their next act, a live-streamed post-ceremony gathering to celebrate their spiritual transition into new love. Invitations were out, camera crews booked, followers waiting. I watched the trailer for it, like one might study the opening scene of a bad play, over-rehearsed, delusional, vulnerable. And I saw the perfect stage. So I waited, patiently. While they prepped their lighting and practiced their lines, I rewired the script. My lawyer set up a legal notice to freeze the joint account they'd once tried to loop me into. My investigator traced the flow of money into offshore channels connected to known cult affiliates. Everything was building, click by click, file by file. They wanted an audience. I'd give them one, just not the one they expected. So tell me, if you had the power to expose two people who shattered your world, would you do it in private, or would you make sure the whole world saw who they really were? I sent out the invitations 2 weeks in advance, each one written with trembling grace and sealed with a note that read, "Healing begins with truth. Join me." No one suspected a thing, not even them. They thought I was finally letting go, that I'd swallowed the betrayal like a bitter pill and chosen the high road, that I was the broken bride who wanted peace. They underestimated me again. The room they booked for their new love ceremony was full. Candles flickered. Soft instrumental music hummed in the background. They stood center stage, dressed in matching linen, hands clasped, faces radiant in their cultish calm. I could almost admire the performance if I didn't know how deeply rehearsed it all was. My ex-best friend teared up as she spoke of transcending past wounds. My ex-fiancé smiled as he said they had released the chains of fear and ego. The audience nodded, sipping their complimentary herbal tea. They were about to play their video tribute, a montage of romantic clips from Bali, Costa Rica, and some dim-lit forest retreat where they danced barefoot in white robes. But then the screen flickered, the music cut, and what played wasn't their video, it was mine. The footage was grainy, secretive, a hidden recording of a Lumen Union gathering, time-stamped just 3 weeks before my wedding. There they were, my ex and my best friend, kneeling among hooded figures, eyes closed, repeating after a leader in monotone. We vowed to sever all bonds with toxic attachments, to silence the disbeliever, and to elevate only the chosen. My name was spoken twice, once with disdain, once with laughter. Gasps shot across the room like sparks. My mother, seated in the front row, clutched her chest and collapsed against my aunt. Someone screamed. Chairs scraped backward. My best friend, ex-best friend, burst into tears and stumbled off stage, mascara streaming. My ex-fiancé looked directly at me from the platform, face pale, mouth twitching, as he tried to form a sentence. "It's not what it looks like, though," he stammered, eyes wide, voice cracking under the weight of exposure. I stepped forward, slowly. My heels echoed across the wooden floor like the ticking of a countdown. I stopped just before the screen and turned to face him fully. "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like," I said, my voice calm, clear, and cold. "And everyone is watching." He didn't say another word. He went silent. You might think that exposing them in front of everyone was enough justice. But justice isn't just about truth. It's about transformation. And mine was far from over. They thought I would disappear, that I would crawl back into obscurity. humiliated and silent, nothing more than a footnote in their liberated journey. But silence was never my destination. It was just the sharp inhale before the exhale that would burn everything they built. The room was still humming from the shock of what they'd just seen. And that was when I stepped back onto the stage. Not as the woman who'd been abandoned, but as the woman who now held the final word. I looked at the audience, the same faces that had once watched me stand in white lace, trembling with hope, and I told them the truth they hadn't seen that day. I displayed the receipts, each line glowing like truth in print. Over $20,000 I had spent, not for a celebration of love, but a stage for deception. And now, that money would fund something real, a recovery initiative for cult survivors, run by the very nonprofit that first helped me uncover the truth. A new fund, a new mission, a new purpose, public, permanent, and named after me. Then came the final touch, the bouquet, the one I never got to toss, preserved in cold, delicate frost. I held it up and told them what I had written on the card. For every bride who was left, not for love, but for manipulation. I handed it to the director of the cult investigation nonprofit and stepped down. Not a single petal fell, not a single word was spoken. Until they stood, applause began with one person, then another, then all. A thunderstorm of vindication. I didn't look at them, not at him, not at her. I didn't need to. Their faces were burned into the footage, their silence already louder than any protest. I walked past the cameras, past the open doors and the stunned faces, and into the bright afternoon air. My veil was gone, my name restored, and my steps, steady, deliberate, echoed not with vengeance, but with victory. The applause faded, but something else began. A new rhythm, quiet yet powerful. If you're still here, wait until you see what healing looks like when it's no longer about survival. The first morning in the new town, I woke up to silence. Not the sharp, cutting kind I'd known in the weeks after the wedding, but a softer silence. One that smelled faintly of rosemary and warm wood, like the little cottage had been waiting for me to breathe again. I wrapped my fingers around the ceramic mug, feeling the steam from the herbal tea rise toward my face. Chamomile, lemongrass, a hint of lavender. I had blended it myself the night before, grinding each leaf slowly like a ritual, as if I could stir healing into the cup. Outside the window, the light crept through pine branches and fell onto my kitchen table like a blessing. For the first time in a long while, I didn't flinch at the sound of my own heartbeat. I volunteered 3 days a week at a small counseling center tucked behind the town library. It was run by a retired therapist named Eliza. Kind, sharp, no nonsense. She didn't ask about my story. She just handed me a clipboard and said, "You look like someone who's had to survive something. We could use more of that here." And so, I became a listener. To women with hollow voices and men with clenched hands. To girls whose eyes darted nervously toward exits. To people who hadn't yet found the words to describe what had been taken from them. I didn't try to fix them. I just sat with them. I brewed tea. I kept the lights soft. I wrote thank you notes for the smallest victories. A phone call made, a door locked, a journal opened. Sometimes in quiet moments, I would pull out the box. Inside were letters, emails, notes, little scribbled thank you cards from strangers who had seen the video. "You helped me leave. I showed your story to my sister. Now I know I'm not crazy." I didn't reply to them. I didn't need to. The silence between us was enough. Evenings became my sacred time. I'd light a candle, jasmine or sandalwood, and write in my journal, not to document pain anymore, but to speak to the woman I had become. I'd write things like, "Today, a girl smiled when she left our office. She hadn't smiled in weeks." Or, "I made soup from scratch, and it reminded me of Sundays with Grandma." Or sometimes, simply, "I was kind to myself today. I planted herbs in the backyard. Mint, basil, thyme. I learned their needs, their stubbornness. Some required more sun, Others only thrived when the soil stayed damp. I watched a rose bloom in late autumn when it shouldn't have. I took that as a sign that healing has no schedule. It arrives when it's ready, quietly, without asking permission. On Thursdays, my neighbor's niece would stop by after school. Sophie, 9 years old, freckles like confetti, always holding a book too big for her hands. She asked me once why I lived alone. I smiled and told her, because sometimes we have to find out who we are when no one's watching. She nodded like she understood, more than most adults ever had. We baked cookies together. She spilled flour on my cat. I didn't mind. She laughed like bells in a spring breeze. Occasionally, the past would knock, sometimes in the form of a headline about the cult, sometimes in the form of a wedding photo I'd forgotten to delete from cloud storage. I didn't delete them anymore. They were part of the story, part of how I got here, part of what made the tea taste sweeter now. One rainy evening, I received a letter postmarked from another state. No return name, just a typed message on cream-colored paper. It read, "I saw what you did. I was one of them once. You reminded me of who I used to be. Thank you." I didn't cry. I just folded it neatly and placed it in the box with the others. Then I poured another cup of tea and opened the window, letting the smell of wet earth fill the room. Somewhere in the distance, wind chimes sang to no one in particular. I wasn't saved by love. I was saved by clarity. Not the kind that comes like lightning, but the kind that hums low in your chest when you finally stop lying to yourself. I was no longer trying to be enough for people who fed off my uncertainty. I was no longer chasing closure from those who were incapable of giving it. I had found my own finish line, painted it in wildflowers, and crossed it barefoot. And now, I was free. Now, what about them? The ones who vanished thinking they'd never face consequences. You might want to stay for this, because karma doesn't forget. They had disappeared from the public eye, at first by choice, then by necessity. In the weeks after the video spread, after the live stream clipped and re-uploaded by thousands, after my words were quoted in hashtags and headlines, my ex-fiancé and my former best friend tried to control the narrative. They issued a vague joint statement about a journey of spiritual awakening, about choosing love over judgment. But it was too late. The silence they had once weaponized now turned against them. Every attempt to explain only unraveled them further. The cult, Lumen Union, was thrust under national scrutiny. Investigative journalists dug deep, tracing donation trails, linking the organization to offshore accounts and blacklisted networks. Authorities launched formal inquiries. Their website vanished one morning, its homepage replaced by a government seizure notice. Forums once filled with cryptic Enlightenment quotes now bore only threads of panic and betrayal. And at the center of it all were two familiar names, his, hers, echoing like cautionary whispers. They had cut off their families long before this. That was part of the doctrine, detached from negative influence. But now, when they reached back out, hoping to find shelter or validation, they were met with cold, hollow silence. His parents changed their numbers. Her sister publicly disavowed her. Their addresses were quietly removed from holiday cards. They weren't disowned with shouting or slammed doors, but with something much heavier, disappointed silence. They moved. A smaller apartment in a town no one knew them in, 2 bedrooms, fewer windows, one less ring on their hands. No one came to their housewarming. No one asked where they'd gone. Once, she had over 5,000 followers on social media. Photos of sunsets captioned with vague affirmations, filtered selfies in cafes. Now her profile sat dormant, like a forgotten gravestone. No comments, no new posts, only archived memories of a life curated on lies. And him. He had been so polished once. Charming, articulate, the kind of man who could smile his way through any confrontation. Now, he flinched in grocery aisles when he thought someone might recognize him. He avoided eye contact at red lights. When people whispered in line behind him, he tightened his jaw, afraid they were talking about the wedding, the cult, the footage. They usually were. He lost the consulting job, of course. The firm didn't even wait for public outrage. They severed ties the day after the video hit 100,000 views. The email was short. Your services are no longer required. He didn't even try to fight it. She tried to start over, briefly. A blog about healing from toxic narratives. But the comment sections wouldn't let her forget. Neither would the mirror. She stopped writing after 3 posts. I didn't reach out. I didn't need to. I didn't sue for damages, though I could have. I didn't expose more than what was already public. I didn't escalate. I just moved on. And in that act alone, I became their reckoning. Because every time they heard my name, on another podcast, another article, another survivor crediting my courage, they were reminded of what they'd lost, what they'd traded for delusion, what they'd burned down thinking it would never be seen in daylight. I had become a symbol they couldn't scrub from their conscience, and I know what it did to them. I know because a mutual acquaintance once told me, softly without glee, that they don't sit together at meals anymore, that she cries when certain songs come on, that he sleeps with the light on, that their apartment is cold, not just in temperature, but in texture, curtains always drawn, conversations clipped, that the only photos on the wall now are of landscapes and strangers, that they don't say my name, not because they hate me, but because they can't bear to. Sometimes I imagine them watching me speak at a conference or read about the foundation I helped build for cult survivors. I imagine him standing in the back, hands in pockets, pretending he just happened to be there. I imagine her scrolling through a screen in the dark, fingers trembling at every new headline. I imagine what they feel when they see me smiling, not to taunt, not to gloat, but to live, unshaken, unafraid, unbroken. And that's the part that eats them the most. Because I didn't destroy them. They did. And the only thing I gave them in return was the mirror. Revenge? That ended a long time ago. What comes next isn't about them. It's about legacy, purpose, and what we leave behind when we choose to rise instead of burn. I never thought I'd write a book, not because I lacked the words, but because I didn't know which version of my voice deserved to be heard. For a long time, I only spoke through silence, measured, deliberate, enduring. But one afternoon, with the winter sun brushing against the windowsill and the scent of dried lavender floating from the vase I had pressed my bouquet into, I sat down and began to write. The first line was simple. He left me at the altar, but I wasn't the one who was lost. I didn't write it for revenge. I wrote it for her, the girl who still checks her phone for a text that never comes. For the woman who stares at herself in the mirror, wondering how she became invisible in her own life. For the people who mistake being left behind as proof of being unworthy. I titled it, Left at the Altar, Raised from the Ashes. It wasn't just my story. It was a signal flare. Every dollar from the book went into a fund. Quietly, without press or ceremony, I named it the Ember Foundation. A resource hub for women navigating the aftershocks of psychological manipulation and coercion. Counseling, housing, legal help, tools I wish I'd had when I was first unraveling what had happened to me. The fund grew faster than I expected. Survivors gave, advocates gave, strangers gave. Not out of pity, but because they recognized their own scars in my words. People began writing to me, some from across the country, some from across the street. They left notes folded between library pages, emails with no subject line, messages signed only with initials. They didn't need to say much. Just, thank you, I'm not crazy, I'm not alone. That was enough. And now, I live quietly. I kept the lace from my wedding gown and turned it into bookmarks. Not because I wanted to hold on to the past, but because I needed to redefine it. I planted roses in my garden, the kind that bloom late and wild, untamed by symmetry. Some mornings, I wake to birdsong and the slow warmth of chamomile steeping in a ceramic cup. The house is old but honest, the kind of place that creaks not from age but from memory. Sometimes, my niece visits. She asks questions, sharp and innocent all at once. Why didn't they love you the way they were supposed to? I smile. Not because I have an easy answer, but because she already sees what I didn't at her age. That love is not measured by grand gestures or vows in a chapel. It's in how someone holds space for you when you break, in how they don't run when you are no longer easy to love, in how they protect your soul, not possess your body. One evening, after a speaking event where I told my story to a room full of survivors and allies, I sat alone by the window. The room was still. The dried bouquet stood upright beside me, petals kissed by years of air and time. And I whispered a truth into the stillness. They thought leaving me would break me. They didn't know I bloom best in fire. It wasn't bitterness. It was rebirth. I used to think forgiveness meant excusing what couldn't be undone. Now I know. Forgiveness doesn't mean inheritance. It doesn't mean they get to keep the story. I do. And I choose to end it with truth, not trauma. Sometimes people ask me if I regret anything. If I wish I could go back and stop myself from walking down that aisle, from loving him, from trusting her. But the truth is, no. Because everything they tried to take from me, they returned tenfold, in a language they couldn't understand. Dignity, community, clarity, purpose. I don't walk with rage anymore. I walk with roots. My voice, once used to whisper apologies into pillows, now echoes through stages and podcasts and late-night phone calls with women just beginning their healing. I tell them what I wish someone had told me the day I stood frozen in front of a congregation of gasps. This isn't your ending. This is your ignition. The legacy I leave isn't just in print or policy or foundation bylaws. It's in the quiet revolution of choosing yourself when no one else does. In building a life not to prove a point, but because it is worth living. And so, the final scene is this. Me standing in a sunlit room with wide windows and floors that carry the faint scent of cedar and tea. The light filters through pale curtains. The dried bouquet stands solemn by the sill. I sip from a chipped mug, one I bought at a flea market for $1.50 because it felt like it had seen things and still held warmth. There is no applause, no audience, just breath and being and the sacred quiet that follows survival. And the last thing I say, not for the camera, not for the book, not even for them, but for myself, clear and steady as dawn. They thought leaving me would break me. They didn't know I bloom best in fire. Thank you for staying with me through every twist and truth. If my story resonated with you, please leave a comment, share your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe. There are more stories waiting to be heard, and maybe yours is one of them.